I bet you feel like a fool. Hey beautiful people, it is I, the Phantom in the Fountain, Fontinalis himself. I'm making this video to outline the various lines of reasoning which have to be overcome by anti-meat advocates before they can claim, as they do, the moral high ground, or the default position, the proven position. So I want to make it clear that the purpose of this video is not to convince anyone not to be vegan. I'm sure I'll make other videos for that purpose, but if you're a vegan for personal reasons, if you're a vegan for moral reasons, if you just find it untenable to suffer animals to be killed on your behalf, that's fine, right? You and I are good. I have no reason to be mad at you for a personal belief and a personal way of life. However, anti-meat advocacy is misleading and dangerous. And before we get into it, I want to make it abundantly clear that I will not tolerate wangery in the comments section. I am prognosticating a monumental amount of wangery. So if I so much as smell the wafting of somebody eating a wang sandwich 3 hills away while I'm reading your comment, it will get deleted. And the reason for that is I don't want to disable comments on this video, but if you start making points that are either tangential or which have been debunked already in the video, I don't want to have to deal with that. So try to follow along with the video. If you have points, please do make them, but be sure that you are very, very careful that you're using good thinking, all right? So I have in my handy-dandy notebook here a list of the topics that I want to cover. I don't have these actually written out, so I'm just going to try to make sure I cover them, but I will outline everything I'm trying to cover right now. So, lines of evidence for meat being a default healthy part of our dietary patterns include human health and nutrition, and particularly sort of cellular nutrition, historical diets, geographical and cultural ubiquity of animal products, the archaeological and paleontological ubiquity of animal products, the evolutionary evidence for animal products being a part of the human diet, the overwhelming anecdotal effectiveness of keto and carnivore diets, clinical studies, the composition and trends of the standard American diet. So there's this really weird idea that the standard American diet implicates meat in anything. Meat is not a very large part of the standard American diet, and it is very easy to show that there's more evidence, not overwhelming evidence, right? I'm not saying this argument is right, but you have to overcome the argument that the standard American diet in fact implicates commoditized calories rather than cellular meat products. We have the ecological arguments for animal agriculture and the sustainability arguments for animal agriculture over plant-based agriculture. We have the inherent endemic failure of the vegan diet. Nobody can do the vegan diet right, so that's something I'm going to bring up. The ideological and emotional foundation of veganism, which essentially states that because there is a good ideological reason, a good moral injunction against killing, the people who are against killing will be more ideologically charged than those who are for killing, because these people who are for killing have to get over their own moral injunctions against the killing of an animal, whereas the people who are following their moral injunctions can be much more militant because it becomes an ideology. So let's get to the first of these, which is health and nutrition. Alright, so if I was to introduce one line of thinking which places the onus, the burden of proof, on vegans and anti-meat activists, it would easily be cellular nutrition. So the idea that somehow eating something whose cells and tissues require the same components as mine, that has the same metabolic needs and processes as I do, the idea that eating that will not provide me with optimal nutrition is a little strange. So you have to demonstrate as an anti-meat advocate that somehow eating something which literally contains everything that my body needs is not sufficient for my nutrition. So mammalian cells, and I eat red meat. I believe that pork and chicken are in fact value-added grain products. They're fake meat, basically. But the way we raise ruminants allows for a large amount of their natural diet to be present, a large amount of grass to be in the ruminant diet. Ergo, ruminants eating their natural diet have all the same vitamins, minerals, amino acids, fatty acids that my body needs, because otherwise they would die. So the onus is on you to prove that cattle are dying of scurvy before they even make it into the slaughterhouse. That's what you have to prove to tell me that eating another animal's tissues won't give me the nutrition I need. You have to prove that in spite of the fact that all mammals have virtually identical levels of vitamins and nutrients, somehow eating a mammal will not give me those vitamins and nutrients, right? Can you see where I'm getting to with this? So I'm not saying that this argument is foolproof. What I am saying is you really have to do some work and prove that that argument I made is somehow wrong. So you could say it's digestion. Well, we have very high acid levels in our stomachs, and we're perfectly capable of producing bile. And when we have high stomach acid and produce bile, we are fully capable of digesting everything that is contained in meat. So that argument doesn't hold up. The fact that saturated fat stimulates the production of bile and the release of bile, that's something you have to overcome. You have to tell me why that doesn't implicate saturated fat as a natural part of the human diet. So the next thing you might say, okay, we can digest animal products, but you have to eat liver, brain, heart, etc. You have to eat organs in order to get all of your needs met through meat. And of course, the first thing I say is this is actually false, but let's assume that it's not. And you say that in order to eat only animal products and to have a fully healthy diet, I need to eat organs. Congratulations, you just made an argument for me to eat animal products. You just made an argument for the consumption of organ meats. And I am 100% of the opinion that we need to be eating more organ meats. I think that I believe that eating more organ meats will lead to a healthier population and less waste from animal agriculture. Okay, the next thing we have to overcome if we want to argue that meat is terrible is the historical ubiquity of meat in our Western diet and in all historical diets. You have to argue that the presence of processed meats, sausages, dairy, all of these animal products in the European tradition, you have to argue with me why they were somehow not leading to the heart disease you predict, how they were somehow not causing all of the cancer that you predict, how somehow people back then didn't have, people throughout our European history did not have rampant type 2 diabetes. That's on you. You have to prove how somehow people were eating sausages and cheese and not getting heart attacks. And of course, you will see throughout cultures, throughout geography, everybody eats animal products. Almost everybody eats fish. Almost every culture ever eats fish, right? Tons of cultures eat dairy. Tons of cultures eat ruminant meat. Ruminant meat was actually a staple in prehistoric diets, as I will get to. So you need to prove to me how heart disease is not a natural part of the human condition when literally everyone is eating these saturated fat, animal protein, and cholesterol-filled products. So the next thing you have to contend with is the archaeological evidence. So there's ample evidence that humans have been killing and eating animals everywhere they went for millions of years. There are sites with literally thousands of carcasses, right? You've got to explain to me how this doesn't suggest that meat is a staple of the human diet. You have to explain to me why the ubiquity of spears, the ubiquity of fire, the ubiquity of migration are not indicative of the consumption of meat. So the next thing you have to contend with, let's address this whole vitamin C and B12 thing. The short version of this is that we lost our ability to synthesize vitamin C back when we were still living in trees as monkeys, when there was abundant fruit because we were living in tropical forests where fruit was abundant. However, once we became human and entered the grasslands and started eating meat, we lost our ability to synthesize B12. And the reason this is important is that the B12 is more recent and is in fact unique to humans. And that means that logically you really can't make any argument except for that the loss of B12 supersedes the loss of vitamin C. So essentially what this comes down to is that as an anti-meat activist, you need to prove that loss of B12 does not indicate that our ancestors were eating significantly higher quantities of animal products than our common ancestor with chimps. So the next thing that you would have to convince me of is why humans have selectively lost our frugivore adaptations and herbivorous adaptations. Why we have selectively lost these and selectively gained carnivorous adaptations. So you've surely heard all of these points before, right? Our colons are so much smaller. Our stomachs are so much more acidic. Both things that indicate meat over fruit. But something else to consider is that if we were still fruit-based, we would have no reason to forego climbing ability for walking ability, which we did. And we would have no reason to forego the ability of our shoulders and arms to hang from branches effectively, and instead become specialized for throwing and holding and manipulating tools. So let's talk about anecdotal effectiveness of keto and carnivore diets. There are literally thousands of people on the internet who have lost 20, 50, 100, 200 pounds on ketotic and carnivorous diets. You have to explain to me how somehow this indicates that meat is bad. You have to indicate to me why people losing weight and having a really easy time and really quick time losing weight, how does this implicate meat as a bad thing? If meat causes diabetes, heart disease, cancer, it's on you to prove why thousands of people are curing their heart disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, immune issues, rheumatoid arthritis, digestive issues. How are people curing their conditions with these diets if meat is bad for you? And of course, that does not prove that meat is good for you, but it really makes it hard for you to demonstrate that it's bad. And of course, you have the clinical successes of low-carb doctors who have ample examples of people going through their programs, lowering or eliminating carbs, and seeing fantastic results. You have to explain to me why this is the exception, not the rule. You have to explain to me why this doesn't indicate that people who are struggling with weight issues should eat keto and carnivore. So let's talk about the American diet. About 70% of the American diet in terms of calories comes from plants. So 70% of the average American's calories come from plants. That's bad news for plants. You have to demonstrate to me that plant foods are not what's causing our epidemics. So if we look at actual trends in the standard American diet, our meat consumption has stayed about the same, but the consumption of pork and chicken has skyrocketed, while the consumption of red meat has gone down over the last 70 years or so. So you have to demonstrate to me why this doesn't indicate that pork and chicken are worse for you than red meat, and how this reduction in red meat corresponding to health issues is not indicative of the healthiness of red meat. That's your responsibility. But let's talk about what has gone up in our diet, and that is commoditized calories. So if we look at the last 50, 60 years of the standard American diet, the average of what Americans are eating, you will find that seed oils have gone up exponentially. 100 years ago, Americans did not eat a significant amount of seed oils. Now, they are the single largest source of calories in our diet. So you have to explain to me how a vegan food, being the largest source of calories in our diet, being completely unnatural, and having known mechanisms for causing chronic disease, you have to demonstrate how this isn't the cause of chronic disease in our society. And let's talk about something which is highly overlooked, and that is the fact that butter, cream, and other animal fats were once a primary source of calories in the American diet. Butter, lard, tallow, and cream used to be major components of the American diet. You know, back when we didn't have so much heart disease, back when we didn't have diabetes. So you have to explain to me why these foods, which were a natural part of our European diet for hundreds, if not thousands of years, are somehow, through their disappearance, causing an uptick in cancer, diabetes, heart disease. And you have to prove that the replacement of butter, cream, tallow, lard with linoleic acid-rich seed oils is not implicated in chronic disease. You have to explain to me how, in a society of endemic chronic disease, our main source of calories, being a completely unnatural substance, is not an issue. So if we look at the replacement of butter and other animal fats with seed oils, we find that butter and other animal fats are optimized for animal nutrition, whereas seed oils are commoditized calories. The oil in a seed makes up about 10% of that seed. It gets pressed out. The rest of that stuff, by the way, is fed to animals. So if you're a vegan who eats seed oils, you're actually subsidizing the animal feed industry. Just something good to know. Let's talk about ecology and sustainability. This video is getting really long, so I'm going to try to keep it short. But basically, animal agriculture is friendly to ecology and demonstrably sustainable. Plant agriculture is very detrimental to ecology and is demonstrably not sustainable. So you can run cattle and other ruminants on a native grassland, and that native grassland will not be ecologically disturbed. It's used to that. It's supposed to have buffalo and elk and pronghorn antelope running through it. It's supposed to have ruminants on it. So you're just operating in a natural way in that ecosystem. But if you raise plants in that field, if you take that prairie and turn it into a plant agriculture field, you have to destroy everything else. You have to destroy all of the plants, you have to kill or displace all of those animals, and you end up destroying the soil ecosystem just for that one crop of grain, right? And on top of that, you kill that crop of grain, and most of the time, most plant agriculture does not cover crop. And as far as people saying that animal agriculture isn't sustainable, the places where animal agriculture has existed since the dawn of time are still performing animal agriculture, whereas most of the places where plant agriculture has been implemented have destroyed their soils and are no longer capable of growing those crops. A good example of this is Mesopotamia. So Babylon used to have huge crops of wheat that they would grow, and it would do so using this marsh system of irrigation. The marshes would flood because it was in a tidal area, and that would irrigate the fields and they would grow their crops. However, by displacing the natural vegetation and the natural ruminants which were living there before, they destroyed the soils, and the soils did not have enough life to combat the salinity of that flooding. So now those areas are not suitable for agriculture because through grain agriculture, humans destroyed the soil. Let's contrast this with Egyptian agriculture. So for most of the second millennium, I'm not sure if they still do practice the same form of agriculture, but they were doing it as of the early 1900s. And they had been doing it since I think the 800s. What they did is in the summer they would grow a cotton crop. That would be their cash crop. They would turn it into textiles. But cotton requires a lot of water, and it's also detrimental to the soil. So what they would do is in the winter they would run a clover crop. And that clover crop would fix nitrogen and improve the soils and desalinate the soils because of the flooding that was happening from the Nile River. What they did is this berseem, this clover crop, they would cut it about 3 times a year and then feed that to oxen, feed that to cattle, as if they would feed it to cattle as forage. And then they would take the manure from the cattle and spread it on the field. And the British people who were observing and documenting this type of agriculture said that if a farmer did not put berseem on his fields and take that manure from the oxen, he would have inarable soils after 2 to 3 years, and he would not be able to continue farming. So that animal agriculture was the only reason that plant agriculture was sustainable in Egypt. So plant agriculture is not the devil, but it does require animal agriculture to be sustainable. So that's another argument that anti-meat activists have to overcome, is the fact that for sustainable agriculture to exist, we need to rely on animals. And of course, one of the big ones, as I said, I am not attempting to discourage people who are fervently vegan in their heart from following a vegan diet. However, there is something to be said for the massive endemic failure of the vegan diet. Every time somebody quits the vegan diet, every time that somebody has too many health issues, you will see the comments from vegans, from the bad vegans. I'm sure there are plenty of vegans who are biting their tongue and being perfectly civil throughout all this. But most of the comments you see on these people's videos, on these people's comments, is you weren't doing it right. Oh, you needed to follow Dr. McDougall. You needed to follow Dr. Greger. You needed to blah, blah, blah. No one ever does the vegan diet right. And that's fine. The problem is that means that failure is a feature of the diet rather than a bug. In other words, failure being so easy and so hard to avoid in the vegan diet is just a factor of following the vegan diet. So follow it if you can, follow if it works for you, but don't force it on other people and then claim that they were doing it wrong when 85%, if not 95% of the vegans out there are leaving veganism and doing it wrong. And of course, the last thing that anti-meat activists have to prove is that it's not a crusade. You have a moral injunction against meat. I get that. You have moral reasons for what you're doing. But all that means to me is that your subconscious mind is more willing to forego good thinking in order to support what you are emotionally attached to. There is so much emotion in vegan videos. There's so much moralism. There's so much virtue signaling. There is just so much ideological, cult-like crusadery. And of course, being on a crusade is fine. But if I'm on a crusade, I have to prove to myself that what I am saying, the ideas I am glomming onto, the models I am building, the evidence I am incorporating and not incorporating into my thought processes, I have to be extra careful that I am doing all those things well. I have to be extra careful that I am not allowing my own personal biases to influence the way I'm thinking. So that's the final burden of proof, is proving that the forcefulness, the confidence, and the charisma that you exhibit when being a proponent of anti-meat propaganda, you have to demonstrate that that is not ideologically, emotionally motivated. And that's hard. So this was not meant to be a takedown. This is a reality check. And I'm sure that there are numerous ways to debunk several of the things I've said in this video. I don't care. The reason I'm making this video is because I'm tired of meat eaters who are seeing results for themselves being trodden upon with the infinite confidence and charisma of vegans. This infinite surety that meat is so bad for you. And I see so many lives being ruined. So many people getting fat. So many old people whose faces are hanging off of their bodies because of the standard American plant-based diet, who aren't getting enough meat to keep themselves healthy. So I hope whether you're carnivore, vegan, anything in between, that you enjoyed this video and that it gave you something to think about. And really my purpose here is elevating dialogue and removing bad thinking, replacing it with good thinking. So if I do that and it all comes up vegan anyways, I don't care. I've done my job. So thank you for watching, and kill it.